son-in-law shoved me into the wall of my own garage and I said nothing, didn't even flinch. The next morning, I left a manila envelope on his truck seat. He picked it up, felt the weight of it, and texted me 3 words, "Finally, thank you." He thought I'd come to my senses. He was wrong about that. I should back up. I spent 31 years as a land surveyor with the provincial government in British Columbia, mostly working out of the Kamloops office. Retired at 63 with a decent pension, a paid-off house in a quiet neighborhood near Brock University in St. Catharines, and more time than I knew what to do with. My wife passed from ovarian cancer 11 years ago. My daughter was 26 when her mother died. She handled it harder than she let anyone see. My son-in-law came into the picture about 2 years after that. The first time I met him, he was driving a truck that looked newer than anything I'd ever owned. Confident handshake. Good at making eye contact, just long enough to feel trustworthy. He said he worked in residential renovation contracting, had his own crew, good reputation in Mississauga. My daughter laughed more around him than I'd seen in years. I told her she seemed happy. I meant it. He asked me for money 11 months after the wedding. $8,000. He was bridging a gap between 2 contracts, he said. Seasonal cash flow issue. He'd have it back to me by March. I wrote the check. He thanked me in the driveway, warm handshake, hand on my shoulder. He seemed genuinely grateful. That matters, I think, because it explains why I didn't see what was coming. March came. No repayment, no mention of it. I let it go another 2 months. Then I brought it up at a Sunday dinner, gently over coffee. He said the second contract had stretched longer than expected. He'd have something for me by summer. My daughter looked uncomfortable. I changed the subject. Summer? Nothing. By the following February, he owed me $14,000. 2 separate amounts, 2 separate excuses. A permit delay on a job in Hamilton. An equipment repair. The kind of explanations that sound reasonable once and start sounding like a script the 3rd time you hear them. Then he came to me with a new number, $22,000. He'd been approached about a contract to renovate a commercial property in Burlington, he said. A restaurant group looking to convert a former bank building. Big scope, guaranteed payment on completion. He needed capital for materials and subcontractors. He spread printed documents across my kitchen table. Estimates, a project summary, what looked like a letter of intent on company letterhead. He'd done his homework, or whoever helped him had. I sat there and looked at those papers for a long moment. I said, "You still owe me $14,000. He said those were different situations. This was guaranteed. I said no. He didn't yell. He didn't flip a table. He went very quiet the way some men do when they're recalculating. And then he stood up from my kitchen table and said I was making a mistake, that family didn't hold grudges over business, that my daughter deserved a husband who could provide for her. He walked out to the garage where I'd been replacing a faucet head on the laundry sink. Followed me out there while I was crouched over the utility basin with a wrench in my hand. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. He grabbed my shoulder and shoved me sideways into the metal shelving unit along the garage wall. A box of hardware fell. My elbow hit the corner of the shelf and I dropped the wrench. I steadied myself and turned around and he was already backing away, hands slightly raised, like the whole thing had been an accident, like I'd lost my balance. My elbow was bleeding through my shirt. My daughter appeared in the doorway between the garage and the kitchen. She'd heard something. She looked at my arm, then at him, then back at me. Her face did something complicated that I didn't have a name for. He said I slipped. That was the word he used. Slipped. Like he was telling her what had happened to me rather than what he had done. I pressed a shop rag to my elbow and said nothing. He drove my daughter home an hour later. She hugged me goodbye at the door. Her grip was tighter than usual and she held it a second longer than she normally would. I stood in the driveway after their taillights disappeared and stood there longer than I needed to. I didn't sleep that night. What I did instead was sit at the kitchen table with a notepad and write down every loan amount, every date, every conversation I could remember. I went through my bank records on my laptop. I printed the transfer confirmations I'd saved as email attachments because I'd had a feeling, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I should keep track. Retired land surveyors document things. It's a hard habit to break. At 2 in the morning, I went out to the garage and looked up at the corner of the ceiling near the back wall. The doorbell camera I'd installed last autumn was visible from inside if you knew where to look. Wide-angle lens. I'd put it up after someone had gone through my recycling bins twice in 1 month. The garage door had been open the whole time he was in there with me. I pulled out my phone and opened the app. The video was clear. You could see his hands come forward. You could see my shoulder jerk sideways. You could see me hit the shelf. You could see him step back and reset his expression before my daughter reached the doorway. I watched it 4 times, sitting on the floor of my garage at 2:30 in the morning with a bag of frozen peas on my elbow. In the morning, I called my friend Gordon's wife, who I knew had worked as a paralegal for 20 years before she retired. She gave me the name of a lawyer she trusted in the Niagara region. I called his office when they opened at 9. His name was Stuart Aldridge, and when I told him what had happened and that I had video, he said, "Come in tomorrow, bring everything." Stuart's office was on St. Paul Street, above an insurance broker. Diplomas on the wall, filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the building went up. He was in his mid-50s, reading glasses on a cord around his neck, the kind of man who listens without nodding too much. He watched the video on my phone twice. He said, "This is assault, cleared out anything I've seen in a while." He walked me through the auctions. We could pursue criminal charges through the Ontario court system. He would help me document everything, prepare the civil case for the outstanding loans and small claims. 14,000 was under the limit, and advised me through the process. He was direct about one thing. Don't contact him. Don't text him. Don't respond to anything he sends. Let the process work. I said I understood. The criminal complaint was filed that week. A process server delivered the civil claim papers to his home address 11 days later. I know the exact moment it happened because my son-in-law called my cell phone 4 times in 30 minutes starting at 2:17 in the afternoon. I watched the screen light up each time and did not answer. The texts started an hour after that. "This is insane. You're suing family over nothing. Call me back. Silas, call me back. I have lawyers too. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." My name is not Silas, but that's essentially what he wrote. The self-assurance in those messages was remarkable. He genuinely believed I wouldn't follow through. My daughter called that evening. Her voice was careful and controlled the way people sound when they've been rehearsing what to say. "Dad, is this real?" "It is." "He said you slipped. He said you're misremembering." "I have it on video, sweetheart." Long silence. She said, "I don't know how to do this." I said, "You don't have to do anything right now. I'm not asking you to choose." She said, "Then what are you asking?" I said I was asking her to trust that I hadn't made this decision carelessly. She didn't answer that. We stayed on the phone for another minute without speaking, and then she said she had to go and hung up. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the photo of her on my refrigerator. She was maybe 12 in that picture, standing outside Ripley's aquarium on a family trip to Toronto, holding a stuffed beluga whale my wife had bought her in the gift shop. She'd been so proud of that thing. Stuart called me the following Thursday with news that rearranged everything I thought I understood about my son-in-law. He said a man named Philip Okafor had contacted his office after seeing a public record of the civil filing. Philip said he had information relevant to the case and wanted to speak with me. I called Philip that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring, careful and measured, like a man who'd been deciding whether to make contact for a long time and had finally committed. He'd been a business partner of my son-in-law's 4 years ago, a renovation and property staging company they'd set up together in Brampton. Philip had put in $30,000 of his own savings. The business had actually done well in its first year. Then Philip started noticing discrepancies, material invoices that didn't match deliveries, payments to a numbered company he didn't recognize. When he raised it at a meeting in my son-in-law's truck in a Tim Hortons parking lot in Mississauga, my son-in-law had grabbed Philip's jacket and slammed his head sideways into the passenger window. Philip had a hairline fracture in his orbital bone. He filed a police report. My son-in-law said Philip had become erratic and aggressive, and that Philip had been the one to escalate. No witnesses. Philip eventually settled a civil dispute for a fraction of what he was owed and signed an NDA. I sat with the phone against my ear and said nothing for a moment. I asked him why he was calling now. He said because he'd stayed quiet and someone else got hurt, meaning me, and he was done staying quiet. Stewart confirmed that criminal testimony is generally exempt from NDA restrictions in Ontario. Philip could testify about the assault without violating the agreement. He came to Stewart's office the following week. I met him in the waiting room. He was maybe 40. Cautious handshake, the kind of calm that comes from having been through something and decided you're going to be steady about it going forward. We didn't talk much before the meeting. We didn't need to. Stewart laid it out. Philip's testimony, established pattern. Pattern was what turned an isolated incident into something harder to explain away. Pattern was the difference between reasonable doubt and an obvious picture. Then Stewart got a call that afternoon that I still think about. A woman in Guelph had seen the civil filing notice through a mutual contact. Her name was Irene Blackstock. She'd hired my son-in-law's crew for a full basement renovation 2 years ago. She'd paid a 40% deposit up front, $12,000. The crew had done 2 days of demolition and never returned. He'd told her there was a materials delay, then a crew health issue, then had stopped answering her calls entirely. She'd never recovered the deposit. She'd filed a complaint with the Terria New Home Warranty Program and the Better Business Bureau, but neither had resulted in anything. Irene was 69 years old and had been saving for that basement renovation for 6 years. When Stewart told me that I thought about my wife, she died in October, 11 years ago. The September before she passed, she'd had a phone call with our daughter that I wasn't supposed to overhear but did. Partly. My daughter had mentioned that money was tighter than expected with the new mortgage. My wife had been quiet about it for 2 days afterward, and then one morning I'd noticed our joint savings account showed a transfer I hadn't made. When I asked her about it, she said she'd moved some money between accounts and changed the subject. I hadn't pushed it. After Irene called Stewart's office, I went home and opened the banking app on my laptop and went back through transaction records as far as the system would allow. November, 3 years ago, in a transfer of $9,000 from my wife's personal account, 2 months before she was admitted to palliative care. The recipient name was a numbered company that I now recognized from the documents Philip had shown me. My wife had transferred $9,000 to my son-in-law's numbered company, and I had not known about it, and she had died without telling me. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I eventually called Stewart. My voice was steadier than I expected. He asked me how I was doing. I said I was fine. Then I said, not really. Then I said, can we talk tomorrow? He said yes. I went to bed at 8 o'clock that night and lay on my back and looked at the ceiling and thought about all the things my wife had believed when she died. I thought about whether she'd been worried, whether she'd felt like she was helping, whether she'd told our daughter or kept it between herself and a son-in-law who was already calculating the next move before she was in the ground. My daughter came over the following Saturday without calling first. She let herself in with her key. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table where I'd spread the documents, and she looked at her mother's name on the bank record, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I knew something was wrong with the account. She told me she'd seen a savings balance that seemed lower than expected once when she was helping her mother with some paperwork. Her mother had said she was reorganizing things. She had believed her. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. She said, "How much does he owe you total?" I added it up again for her. My 14,000, my wife's 9,000, Irene Blackstock's 12,000, Philip Acaffer's 30,000 that he'd settled for almost nothing. I told her there were probably amounts I didn't know about. She said nothing for a minute. Then she said, "I kept making excuses for him. Every time I thought something was off, I told myself I was being paranoid, or that I didn't understand his business the way he did. I said that was what some people are good at, making you feel like the confusion is yours." She got up and stood at the kitchen window for a while. She said, "What do you need from me?" I said I wasn't going to ask her for anything. She said, "Dad, what do you need?" The preliminary hearing was on a Tuesday in March. The courtroom in the St. New, Catherine's courthouse was small, and the light from the windows was flat and gray, the way Ontario courthouse light always is. Stuart was in a dark suit. My son-in-law sat across the room with his lawyer, who was younger than I'd expected, and kept reviewing notes on a tablet. They played the garage video on a screen. I watched my son-in-law watch himself on screen. His jaw tightened once and then went still. Philip testified. He was precise and detailed and answered every cross-examination question without getting defensive. When the defense lawyer suggested he had financial motivation to lie, Philip said he'd settled his civil claim years ago and the money was gone either way. He said he was there because the pattern needed to stop. Irene Blackstock testified by video link from her kitchen in Guelph, sitting very straight in her chair, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She described the deposit, the 2 days of work, the silence. She described filing every complaint available to her and recovering nothing. She was not dramatic about any of it. That made it worse. Then my daughter walked to the witness stand. My son-in-law leaned over to his lawyer immediately, and I saw the lawyer put a hand on his arm. She testified that she had been present when the incident in the garage occurred, that she had seen her husband's hands on my shoulders, that she had seen me hit the shelf, that she did not believe it was accidental. She testified that she had stayed in the marriage for 3 months after the incident because she was afraid and because she had not fully understood at the time what she was looking at. Her voice didn't waver. He said her name once from across the room. Low, almost private. The judge told him to be quiet. She kept going. The judge found him guilty of assault causing bodily harm. Sentencing included a restraining order, a conditional sentence with house arrest for 90 days, mandatory counseling, and restitution payments to be determined pending the civil proceedings. The civil claim in small claims court had already been scheduled for the following month. He was escorted out through a side door. He didn't look at me. My daughter and I walked out of the courthouse separately. I found her standing near the parking lot, car keys in her hand, facing the street. I stood beside her and we watched traffic for a moment. She said, "I keep thinking about Mom." I said, "Me too." She said, she thought she was helping me. I said, "Yes." She said, he let her believe that, right until the end. There's no good response to a thing like that. I didn't try to give one. We drove back to my house and I made coffee and she sat at the kitchen table. She didn't drink hers. She turned the mug in circles on the table slowly, the way she used to do with her juice glass when she was small and distracted. She told me she'd been staying with a colleague while the legal proceedings were ongoing, that she'd started seeing a counselor in January, that she was sleeping better than she had in 2 years. I said that was good. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner in the investigation." I said she didn't need to apologize. She said she was doing it anyway. In the weeks that followed, there were things to manage. The civil claim, correspondence from Stuart, a brief period during which my son-in-law's lawyer sent a letter threatening a defamation counterclaim over something I'd mentioned to a neighbor. Stuart said it had no foundation. It went nowhere. Philip sent me an email in April. 2 lines. He said thank you for not letting it stop at documentation. I wrote back 1 line. He'd done the harder thing by testifying, not me. I didn't hear from Irene directly, but Stuart told me her claim was being settled through the civil process and that she was likely to recover most of the deposit. My daughter had dinner at my house on the first Thursday of every month. That became a routine. She'd bring something from the Lebanese place on St. Paul Street that she knew I liked. We'd eat and not talk about everything that had happened. And then gradually, over several months, we started to talk about it a little. In the way that you eventually can, when enough time has passed. One evening in June, she found an old photo album my wife had put together years ago. She sat at the kitchen table going through it slowly. She stopped at a photo from a camping trip at Killarney Provincial Park 20-something years ago. My wife standing waist-deep in a lake laughing at something off-camera. My daughter set the album down for a moment. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. She said she would have figured him out eventually. Mom, she would have seen it. I said yes, she would have. She said, I just wish she'd had the chance. I thought about that for a long time after my daughter went home. Sat in the living room with the lights off, which I'd gotten into the habit of doing in the evenings, just sitting in the dark for a few minutes before bed. There's something settling about it. The house quiet, the street quiet, the particular stillness of a place where you've lived long enough that it knows you. I thought about what my wife would have said about all of it. She was a practical woman. She didn't believe in letting things fester. She used to say that silence was fine for listening and not much else. I thought she would have been glad it was documented, that there was video, a court record, a judgment with his name on it, that the story hadn't stopped at a shelf in a garage and a son-in-law saying the word slipped. I thought she would have been proud of our daughter. The appeal my son-in-law filed was dismissed in September. Stuart called me at 8:30 in the morning to tell me. I thanked him, said I'd send the final payment for his invoice that week. We hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I poured coffee, went to the back window, and watched a pair of mourning doves on the fence post at the edge of the yard. They sat there for a while doing nothing in particular. Then they flew off. I drank my coffee. It was an ordinary morning. That felt like enough. I keep coming back to that moment in the garage. Not the shove itself, I've made my peace with that. But the second after, when he stepped back and reset his face and said the word slipped. That word, like if he chose it quickly enough, it would become true. I've thought about that a lot, about how much of what he did depended on people accepting the version of events he handed them. My wife accepted one, my daughter accepted several. I almost accepted a few myself. What stopped me wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. Anger was there, but it wasn't what kept me steady. What kept me steady was something quieter, a kind of basic insistence on accuracy. 31 years of land surveying will do that to you. You learn that the ground doesn't lie. You learn to measure twice and trust the numbers. When I sat on that garage floor at 2:30 in the morning watching myself get shoved on a 4-inch phone screen, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking, this is what actually happened, and it deserved to be recorded correctly. There's something in that, I think, that goes beyond any one situation. The people who took advantage of my wife's care, of Irene's savings, of Philip's trust, they counted on a specific thing. They counted on decent people being too uncertain, too polite, too exhausted to insist on what they knew was real. And for a while, that calculation worked. Philip signed an NDA. My wife transferred $9,000 quietly. My daughter explained away what she saw in that garage doorway. None of them were weak. They were just reasonable people trying to preserve something. A relationship, a peace, a version of family they'd believed in. Being reasonable is not the same as being wrong to do that. But there comes a point where clarity is more honest than accommodation, where you do a greater harm by looking away than by looking directly. What I learned, not just from this, but from watching Philip sit in that witness chair and Irene speak steadily into a video screen from her kitchen in Guelph, is that it takes a particular kind of courage to stay factual when everything emotional is pulling you somewhere else. Not the dramatic kind of courage, the quiet kind. The kind that wakes up at 2 in the morning and pulls out a notepad and writes down dates and amounts instead of pouring another drink. And it takes something else, too. A willingness to think clearly, even when clarity is painful. My daughter had to be smart about what she was seeing, had to stop filling in the gaps with the explanations he'd handed her. That's not easy to do when you love someone. It might be the hardest intellectual act there is. To look at a pattern and follow where it actually leads instead of where you wish it went. She did it eventually. Philip did it years late, but he did it. Irene never stopped trying through every formal channel available to her. None of us came through it unchanged. That's not the point. The point is that we came through it with the record straight. My wife's name on that bank transfer is documented now. What it was for and what it wasn't is part of an official record in a courthouse in St. Catharines. That matters to me in a way I find hard to explain, but don't feel the need to justify. The doves came back to the fence post this morning. I noticed that.